Hi everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities and challenging norms. I'm Sandy Ruxton, and I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Burrell. Where are you now, Stephen? You've just been on leave, haven't you?
Yes, hi everyone. Hi Sandy. Yes, I'm back in Australia now, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, who are the first people of the part of Melbourne in which I live. I was indeed on holiday recently. I was actually visiting a national park here in the state of Victoria called Wilson's Promontory. So I got to see lots of Australian wildlife there, including numerous wombats, which was very exciting, as I'm sure you can imagine. What about you, Sandy? How are you doing?
I'm fine, Stephen. I've moved house successfully, which was quite a big deal, and last night I was singing with my choir, backing the Spooky Men's Chorale. Avid listeners of our podcast will remember that we interviewed Dominic Stitchbury some time ago about men in choirs. So I've been following that little theme. But anyway, in the UK, there's been a huge political upheaval recently with the appointment of a new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, and a new cabinet, new ministers. So we thought it would be timely to have our first politician on the show. He's Alistair Strathern, Labour MP for the constituency of Hitchin, just north of London. And he's just been reappointed Parliamentary Private Secretary in the Treasury. So congratulations, Alistair, for that.
Yes, and Alistair won an 8,000 vote majority at the last election in a typically blue home county seat to continue to represent his community. But the main reason we've invited him on the Now and Men podcast is that in Parliament he co-chairs the Labour group for Men and Boys, which is, and I'm quoting from your bio here, Alistair, a campaigning group of MPs pushing the Labour government to speak to young men and build a better masculinity. He's also a former maths teacher and climate insurance lead at the Bank of England. And I'm pleased to say that, like me, he's currently a very happy, lifelong fan of Aston Villa Football Club.
All the best people are.
Absolutely. So hi, Alistair, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. So perhaps we could just start off just by asking you a bit about the Labour group on Men and Boys, which you co-chair with Amanda Martin, who's the MP for Portsmouth North. Could you just tell us a bit about why the group was set up, you know, what you're seeking to do with it, what you're aiming to achieve, and what you'd like to develop from it?
Absolutely. Well, I think in the Labour Party, we're incredibly and rightly proud of the proud record we've had over many decades now of taking on equalities issues and trying to break down some of the barriers people face to success in their life, whether that's class, whether that's gender and the kind of work we've done around women's liberation and women's kind of role in the workplace, or whether that's race. I think the Labour Party has been at the forefront of some of the big progresses we've been able to make as a society over the last few decades on some of those. But I think a few of us were very conscious that at times, because of that proud record, and particularly the fact that there's so much more to do to break down many of the barriers too many women face in society still to this day, we've sometimes been reluctant at speaking to the very particular issues that men and boys can face on their own terms too. And at a time when some of the worst corners of the internet and more radical voices in politics potentially preying on that vacuum to speak to young men and boys in this country with very restrictive views about what manhood should look like and what politics should look like for them, we think that's a really wrong-headed approach for our party to take. And we think those causes are as progressive as any other when it comes down to breaking down barriers to opportunity, success and self-realisation. And actually there's a role for Labour in being much more robust in speaking directly to and addressing some of those challenges on their own terms and in ways that really connect with young men and boys in the country today.
And how would you characterise Labour's approach now to issues affecting men and boys? I mean, you said a bit about it there, but and does your approach differ to the approach of other political parties?
I certainly hope so. I think what I'm really encouraged by the fact is that we have an approach full stop. Right. A few years ago, the idea of a Labour Prime Minister holding an International Men's Day reception at number 10 would have felt quite fanciful. But actually, last year, Keir Starmer was the first Prime Minister ever, Labour or otherwise, to host an International Men's Day reception, to bring together fantastic groups from men's health organisations, to role model groups, to male educators, and talk about the really important work they were doing in their communities and how, as a government, we need to do better sometimes at noticing it, understanding the issues they were seeking to address, and delivering, through the arms of the state, good central solutions to support some of those problems too. And the work that we're now starting to do in the run up to hopefully a summit later this year to build out, I guess, what a progressive government led offer looks like to men and boys growing up in Britain today is really exciting. It's been a big part of what we've been asking for as a Labour group and something I'm keen to see delivered in as ambitious way as possible now.
And what issues do you think should be prioritised? I mean, I know there's activity already around NEETs, so-called, those who are not in education, employment or training. But I think you've also got interests around fatherhood and care and paternity leave and education and relationships. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about some of the things that you've been interested
Absolutely. So as a group, we've kind of divided the work we do into kind of 4 or 5 key lenses that we think speak to some of the specific gender challenges that men and boys can be facing in Britain today. One of those, as you talked about, is work. And when we talk about the NEET problem, there's quite a strong gendered element to some of that. We haven't seen the number of young men entering the workforce renormalise since COVID in the way we have more so with women. And so thinking about some of the gender barriers to men getting into work, some of the industries that typically men would have looked for those first careers and the way in which those have declined in parts of the country, but also trying to reset for young men an idea of what the right careers for them might look like. It's a real shame in this country at the moment that we don't have a particularly gendered balanced workforce when it comes to youth work, when it comes to teaching, when it comes to healthcare professions, those healed professions that others talk about. And thinking about how we can get more young men into those is not just a great opportunity to provide better role models for young people in those youth settings. It's also a great opportunity to break down, I guess, some of the perception barriers about what careers might be available for young men growing up in Britain today. So that's work. Education, we know obviously we're very keen to kind of provide more positive role models for men through education and youth settings, and that's been a big part of our work, given all of the evidence about how positive male role models are particularly important for young men growing up in Britain today, given the extent to which they look to them sometimes as a sense of what being a man should look like in Britain today when it's such a contested topic. Alongside that, though, there are very particular barriers to male achievement that we're keen to see broken down too. If you look at a lot of the education data, whether it's literacy rates, whether it's progression in early years, there's quite a big gender gap in terms of performance levels. And so making sure that we've got a political system that's conscious of those, understands the driver of those, and then keen to address them in its policy making is a big priority for us too. And then the third strand of kind of education, where it then bleeds into the kind of relationship work we do too, is ensuring that we're creating spaces in schools for really good and effective conversations about healthy understanding and attitude to gender relationships and contentment. We're very aware at the moment that obviously the advent of social media has brought forward many positive opportunities for young people, but it's also put them in touch with people who've got quite extreme views sometimes about what being a man should look like, what that should mean in terms of how they approach relationships, what the dynamics for different genders should be in relationships. Those are obviously completely wrong-headed, but we don't always do a very good job in schools at creating spaces for young people to explore why that might be the case and giving them the platform and, I guess, the confidence to start to define on their own terms what healthy attitudes to genders and relationships should look like for them. We're lucky enough to partner with fantastic groups like Beyond Equality, who do really good strength-based conversational work in schools already on this. And I think learning from the great work that's already going out there, providing a platform for it in Parliament, and then bleeding that into the government's work around curriculum and PHHE reform is going to be really important. And then, as you mentioned too, I think trying to reset kind of male attitudes to caregiving and family life. We're, at the moment in a really unfortunate position in this country where we're obviously very keen to try and break down gendered aspects to caregiving and parenting, but the imbalance between men and women and who takes on those caring responsibilities is hardwired into our parental leave system. At the moment, it's much more likely and encouraged by the state in terms of your entitlements for women to step back from work during those crucial formative early months and look after a new child than it is for a dad to be around. And that's, there's a whole host of kind of social and personal reasons for that, but it's also something that's very much hardwired into those entitlements. And the fact that we've got some of the worst Paid and supported paternity leave entitlements in the UK at the moment is something we're very keen to put right, because not only is it the right thing to do, it's also something that all of the evidence shows in Europe and then those parts of the states that have led the way on this actually can play a really crucial role in breaking down those gendered barriers too. Unsurprisingly, when you give new dads more time and more support to be there for their kids early on in life, they want to do it, they form better bonds, and they're more likely to be taking on caregiving roles in the home years later too. And so breaking down those perceptions through all of the levers we have, from education to entitlements, I think is something that as a group we're really keen to lead on.
Thanks for that very good summary of all those different areas that you're active on. And I think we might like to sort of tease out a little bit more some of those. But on the one that you just mentioned, the paternity leave issue, I guess a key question there is, what are the main obstacles to actually being able to push that further? Is it that, businesses fear increased costs, or, do we think maybe that, more employees might end up being contracted and therefore not having employment rights in the same way? What would you see as the main problems for?
I guess it's two barriers, right? It's breaking down perceptions around kind of costs and friction, but then it is also kind of ensuring that it's prioritised and funded in a way by government that truly delivers on its ambitions and makes sure that it's a universally available benefit and entitlement, rather than one that's just the preserve of the middle classes. So taking it in reverse, at the moment, we've moved in towards a system of gradual incremental flexibility. We've got very limited statutory paternity leave rights in the UK at the moment, and it's just at statutory paternity pay levels, which is well below median earnings, and so it tends to be just those who've got high levels of income or high savings to fall back on that can afford to take it. We've supplemented that so far with an ability to share parental leave, so to lose some of that better paid entitlement that mothers will often have and enable that to enable more dads to take leave. But again, that's at a very low pay level, and so unsurprisingly, it's really only the highest earners that have taken up that so far, which explains why uptake is so low. And so if we're going to have an offer that genuinely moves the dial in a way that supports families right across the UK, whatever their income, but also genuinely helps to reset those gendered norms around caregiving and parenthood, it's got to be something that is financially accessible to everyone. And so it is something that the government is going to have to play a role in funding, rather than just creating as a leave entitlement that isn't necessarily financially supported. There's obviously, business concern too, but actually we've been really encouraged working with employers big and small about their attitudes to it. We've done lots of work with the FSB, who I think, as long as it was financially supported by central government, would be very supportive of something that enables their employees to kind of live those happy, rounded, fulfilling lives. But we've also done lots of really interesting work with big employers who do already go above and beyond, including a few major supermarkets and some other big chains, where they've seen really, important and positive payoffs in terms of employee productivity, satisfaction, retention, by giving them the space to be there for, what are incredibly joyous but also quite stressful formative early weeks and months with their partner.
Something I was wondering, Alistair, we met you at the launch of the End Violence Against Women and Beyond Equality guidelines called Building Bridges, Principles for Work with Men and Boys to End Violence Against Women and Girls. I was just wondering, how do you think we can address some of the issues you're talking about, that we can engage with men and boys about these things without in the process, marginalising women's voices or experiences, or, that risk of men taking over the conversation about gender equality, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think it's something we want to be really, really conscious of, right? Because fundamentally, we've got a lot more to do on all of those issues. And actually, there are still a huge amount of gender barriers facing women, and the extent to which far too many face violence in their home, in relationships and in society is right up there with one of the most extreme and egregious examples. But I think the work is important for two reasons. One, because it's important of its own right and men and boys matter, but also because we're only going to really tackle those issues if we can, take on head on some of the challenges, misconceptions, barriers to men stepping up and being those strong, powerful, equal allies in society that we know many of them want to be, but don't always feel empowered or able to step into. And it's why a lot of the groups we've started working with kind of came out of that, right? So Recommender, a kind of big global charity, came out of work to try and crowd more men into to tackling violence against women and girls in Brazil. But through their work, they learned that actually, if you're serious about that work, you've got to be serious about breaking down the barriers that exist in society to men stepping into it, and actually trying to kind of rethink what manhood should look like with care at its heart. And their kind of Men Care campaign is something we're very supportive of, but it's something we're very keen to centre as part of our work too. But I think ensuring that we're respectful of the huge, huge barriers, women, not just of the barriers that women face in life, but the important work that women's-led organisations are already doing, and will need to continue to do in this space, that we're being very coordinated in how we work together. And I think those principles that kind of launched at the event that we were talking about there are a really good and important way to start to think about how we can do that in a way that builds trust and kind of builds solidarity across the movement, so that they are very much seen as different parts of the same continuum, rather than kind of falling into this wrong-headed idea that it somehow has to be a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what do you think we as men can do to challenge, the violence of other men against women, for example? I mean, I used to be a trustee for the White Ribbon campaign. I'm not sure if you've come across that. Is that a campaign you would support, for example?
Oh, absolutely. And we, had a lovely conversation with its founder actually quite recently to talk about the kind of principles behind it. And I think one of the things he, was talking to about us about it, and it kind of really landed with, I think, so much of the work we're trying to do is actually just breaking down men's misconceptions about the social context they operate in. He was talking really powerfully about some school-based interventions they'd seen and supported and kind of mirrored in workplaces around not needing to remind men that violence against women and girls isn't okay, because most men, already are there and then some. It's about reminding men that other men feel the same way about those issues too. And actually, if they do step up and speak out and are strong and vocal allies in their workplace, in their community, in their school, not only is that something that's true to their values, which they already often recognise it is, but it's something that will be welcomed by other men in their setting too. Because all too often, I think a barrier to men acting isn't what they think themselves. It's recognising that attitude is one and the same of all of their peer group too, because it's not something we always create platforms to talk about. And actually, where they do see men talking about these issues, particularly online, it can often be in very regressive or dismissive ways. But actually, I think finding nice social cues to remind men in their workplace, in their schools, in social settings, that actually we all care about it. None of us really think this is okay. And we'll all welcome the moments where each of us step up a bit more and call it out, and are those vocal supportive allies when we do see issues around violence against women and girls in our communities is crucial. And all the evidence suggests can be really very powerful actually in facilitating and then platforming spaces where men will then start to be those kind of strong vocal allies that we all want to see.
I wanted to just go back to the notion of male role models, which you mentioned earlier. I mean, clearly that's a very common notion of, what's needed for bringing up healthy boys. But there are also some, other ideas about how children learn about gender. So, gender may be contested in the playground, for example. And also, the notion of male role model. Well, who is a male role model? Is it your dad, or is it a rich footballer, who you're rather distant from? We need to think about that. We also need to think about the influence of mothers, I think, as well, because they're crucially important in boys' development, and the other way around probably, that girls benefit from dad's involvement as well. So I just wondered if you want to say a little bit more about how you understand the notion of male role models, because it's a fairly slippery concept, I suppose, is my point.
Absolutely.
It's worth teasing it out a bit more.
Definitely, and it's a hotly contested one, and one that can be an easy entry point into a universe of competing ideals that are actually ultimately very different to each other in terms of what they see. And so I guess starting with a negative definition, I think there are some people whose kind of entry point into the male role model debate and the importance of fathers is really around occasionally masked quite a regressive view about what a family unit has to look like. And the idea that in somehow a child's life is lessened if a father is not there, and that it is always right for the father to be an active part of a family unit. Where in fact, a big part of the kind of social progress we've unlocked over the last few decades has been rejecting the notion that it is always important and always the right thing for families to stay together. And there will often be lots of very good and very important reasons why actually it is not the right thing for a dad to be in their child's life. And actually thinking through instead, from my perspective, not a kind of a regressive, narrow view of male role models, and let's not neglect the importance of fathers. A big part of why we want to talk about active parenting and caring fatherhood is because where it is right and good for fathers to be present in their lives, we want to help platform, encourage and support them to step up and play that role in an even more active and present way. But in those worlds where it isn't possible and isn't right, actually thinking about socially how we can all provide those kind of positive male role models for the young people in our society, in our school setting, in those youth groups, in our community is so important. And I think that kind of social construct of kind of male role models is the lens through we come from. But you're absolutely right, the value of men kind of modelling positive characteristics, positive attitudes around gender, positive caring interactions with women in their life isn't just important for young men, though it's often particularly important for young men given some of their own barriers and all of the evidence about how limited some of their kind of exposure to those kind of portrayals of masculinity can be otherwise. But it's really important for women to see that too, right? And ultimately, if we're going to break down kind of very gendered ideas about how men and women should behave, how they should interact with each other, the types of work men and women should do, we don't just need to break that down for men, we need to break that down for everyone. And in doing so, create a society where actually we're much better able to just see each other on our own terms and our own values rather than through these kind of particular frames and lenses.
Talking about role models and like the influence of public figures, I was wondering about your experience of being in Parliament, really, which has obviously changed a lot over the decades, but I think there's still a lot of talk about how it is quite a gendered culture in Parliament. I mean, how have you found that yourself, would you say?
Oh, it definitely can be in whole hosts of ways. And I think, one of the things I'm very privy to is the fact that most of my exposure to that isn't direct, as someone who is often kind of on the historically more valued side of that split, but it's actually through conversations with my female colleagues and the way in which some of them have been asked, which MP they work for and issues like that and questions like that, which just would simply never be raised with me, even as a relatively young man in Parliament. So I think it is definitely somewhere where some of those regressive attitudes and I guess regressive gender frames still are present. I think the thing that gives me hope and encouragement is the fact that I've joined Parliament as part of such a big, energetic cohort of Labour MPs who really care about this issue, are really live to it, and I think aren't willing to tolerate a kind of slow pace of progress on it anymore. And the way in which I think we're all finding ways to be allies to each other and speaking up and calling out where we do see some of those gendered aspects playing out gives me great hope. Still a long way to go, right? I don't want to claim that we're anywhere close to a silver bullet, but it's an energizing team to be part of and one that I feel a great sense of joy in kind of working with on issues like this.
I did some interviews some time ago for the History of Parliament Oral History project, and that's mainly with politicians who are at the end of their careers or have left Parliament. And some of the stories coming out there from those interviews are quite shocking about behaviour in the past. And so I take your point that actually there has been a huge amount of progress, and even just in terms of representation as well. I think are we on about sort of 45% women, 55% men in the UK Parliament now? That's a big change over a relatively short period of time, and I guess some of the sort of more family friendly arrangements. I'm not sure there's, as you say, there's a lot more to do. But MPs like Harriet Harman did do a lot of work around this, didn't they, over the years?
Oh, definitely. And while obviously, we still rail against the frustrations that we still find there, I think we all feel very lucky to get to serve at a moment where we're building off a tremendous amount of good work that's already been done by some real trailblazers before us. And Harriet is obviously right up there, I think, for many of us in terms of politicians who've really recognised the kind of centrality of tackling that issue and not shied away from calling it out, from working on it, even when it wasn't always the most popular or politically expedient thing to try and drag the conversation to.
do you think that, because we were talking about role models and leadership, like what role do you think politicians have to play in that, if we're thinking about masculinity? Because I guess, you don't have to look very far, unfortunately, to find some quite, potentially harmful examples of leadership, from men across the world, or indeed, in UK politics at the moment, perhaps. Do you have any thoughts about that? About, what role you think politicians, men in politics, have about setting an example?
Oh, absolutely. We are, I guess, one of those socially present role models who've got that responsibility as much as any other. And I think ensuring that we're not perpetuating kind of harmful visions of kind of manhood and masculinity, nor falling into tropes in terms of the way we talk about kind of manhood and what male success should look like in 21st century Britain is really, really important. But then I think also, as progressive politicians, we've also got that responsibility, sitting behind the rationale of the Labour group of men and boys, to speak to and feel comfortable talking to these issues too, to not shy away from them, to not think that they're somehow not progressive causes in and of their own right, and to not cede that platform to maybe some of those politicians who do have more regressive, narrower views about masculinity, about what success would look like for men, about kind of gender and the way in which relationships should function in a modern society, and not giving them the space to just have those conversations on their own, but actually feel confident enough and empowered enough to take on that kind of progressive argument about why these issues really matter.
I'm so impressed by your commitment to this issue, Alistair, and I'm just sort of wondering where that's come from for you. Because were you just born at the right time, or
I think it certainly helps, right? I think it certainly helps to have come of age at a time when these, there was already progress being made on some of these issues. I think probably thinking back to my time in teaching and the way in which I think I was very aware that my kind of presence as a male teacher was particularly important for some of the most disaffected young men that I was working with. And actually how important the connections and the relationships I was able to build up with some of those young men were for kind of helping to get them engaged, not just in my lesson, but also kind of in their own kind of journeys of self-development too. And that definitely carried into my kind of experience as a local councillor when I was in charge of children's services and looked after children. But I think also kind of building all that experience and then kind of finding itself in a kind of a slightly frustrating space of, seeing, some of the more extreme corners of the internet and politicians talking to these issues and progressives not. And also, I think seeing some of the shallowness of some of the discourse that was provoked by some of the kind of more cut-through moments touching on it. So whether it's adolescence, the Louis Theroux documentary, it definitely feels like, we set up the Labour group for men and boys at a time when some of these issues suddenly were being thrust more into the spotlight. But I think all too often it felt like the discourse around it could be very shallow, a bit superficial at times, and not really particularly introspective about some of the driving factors behind it, nor particularly mobilised towards what the policy solutions should be to the problem we're trying to tackle, other than just kind of reviling at the kind of the issue and recognising that there clearly was something bad going on there. And so I think a desire to ensure that we made the most of this spotlight, drove it into solutions that really matter, and leveraged the really good, rich practice-led work that is going on out there in so many of these spaces already with some of the groups that we partnered with, I think probably sits behind the motivation for setting the group up when we did, and why I think it's been such a kind of strong start to its existence in terms of the impact it feels like we're already starting to have in terms of driving conversations in Westminster.
I mean, we're aware as well, Alistair, that you have a strong commitment around addressing the nature and climate emergency, which is something we feel very strongly about as well. That was the area you were working before you entered politics. Do you think are there any, do you think men have a particular responsibility there? Do you see overlaps? For example, perhaps there's some evidence that men can be a little bit more resistant to climate action, for example. Is that something you've given much thought to?
I think potentially there is probably something in ensuring, and it's true across everything, but I think climate calls out an area where it's kind of particularly underexplored at the moment, thinking through where there are big gendered gaps in attitudes to policy areas, rather than just despairing at those and kind of waving our hands at them or noting them and moving on, actually being really politically and intellectually curious about why that might be, what that tells us about how people think about the problem, think about themselves too, in society at the moment, and what we need to do, I guess, to kind of reshape people's narratives around it. And I guess, it's not why we do it at all, actually, but I would hope that, one of our goals around creating a more caring conception of manhood, men who are more involved in their family lives, more involved in looking after their children as active parents, grandparents, uncles, kind of social parents in the wider community, and the closer ties to future generations that maybe creates, is maybe maybe a positive spillover effect of that will be a slightly greater connection to some of those intergenerational concerns that I think sit behind a lot of people's core conception of kind of the risks of climate change too. It's absolutely not why we do it, but I think I could see a world in which that does end up being I guess, a positive side effect of some of the work. But I think the point you speak to is an absolutely valid one, which is, as politicians, sometimes when we see gendered gaps in terms of how people respond to different policy issues, we need to be much better progressives at not just kind of taking those as accepted facts or somehow kind of necessary truths, but actually being curious about what the social factors are that sit behind them and shaping our policy, our comms, and our politics around tackling that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, in terms of challenging ideas of masculinity, I guess you can point to men who do really engage in care for the environment or for animals as perhaps doing that in one form, for example, can't you? Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
I was just thinking, well, we're probably coming to the end of our time, so I think perhaps I just wanted to thank you for spending time with us, really. And I'm aware that I think you've been reappointed as a parliamentary private secretary in the Treasury. Is that correct?
I have indeed.
So,
Rest for the wicked.
That's effectively a sort of link between ministers and backbenchers. And so it's an important role, and I think it's sometimes seen as a sort of first step on a parliamentary, ladder towards being a minister. So I just wanted to sort of congratulate you on that and wish you all the best in your future, and obviously hope that you will take forward this important work.
Oh, look, and thank you guys so much too for all you're doing, spotlighting these conversations, both on the podcast but in your wider work too. It feels like we've got a real moment right now where suddenly there is a lot more social and political focus on these issues. But it's so important that drives A, action, and that B, that action is driven by a really informed understanding of what the underlying issues are and a good progressive vision from my perspective of where we want to get to with them. And I think it's conversations like these, the work I know both of you guys have been leading for some time now, but also a lot of the practice of work of the groups we're working with at the moment, that give me such hope that there is some real progress to be made here. And I'm just looking forward to working with yourselves and the whole wider ecosystem over the coming years to ensure we live up to the moment, really.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'd like to keep in touch with you as well, and send you our thoughts on various things as and when. So
and thank you so much for speaking to us, but also for showing an example to hopefully other men in politics, who can follow your lead and speak out more about these issues. I did have just one more very quick question, which was just, will you be supporting Count Binface? Does he offer a different model of masculinity?
What did Count Binface tell us about healthy gender norms? Discuss. What I think he does do actually is kind of like, for me, it's obviously like putting aside the politics of how just brilliant it is to have such a brilliant showcase of the ridiculousness of the way in which Farage is looking to judge scrutiny at the moment through the by-election. I think he points to, I guess, a self-deprecating softness to British kind of character and politics that I think is actually there to be tapped into for a whole wider range of causes too. So I'm not sure if it necessarily says something about masculinity, but I think it does say something about the social psyche of what makes Britain so great, that I think progressives are at our best when we are better in tune with and speak to a little bit more. So no, I'm enjoying it, and I hope the people of Clacton do the right thing.
Yeah, unfortunately there's 32 candidates now, so I'm a bit worried about the Binface vote being split many different ways. Oh dear.
Really loved it. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye. Bye.
So, Sandy, it was really interesting to get a chance to talk to Alistair there. For example, what he had to say about male role models was very interesting, and I'm sure that, especially for you, given that's something you've kind of done some research on, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I was interested in the issues around schooling, certainly, which we didn't really talk about in any depth. I mean, the idea that we need to increase the number of teachers, male teachers at primary and secondary schools, that's been around for a long time. And, I think there's even been targets in the past. Maybe there's been targets talked about now. I'm obviously not against that, but I do think there is an issue about, is there something distinctive that male teachers provide that female teachers don't, And I think that there is research. I mean, people like Becky Francis have written about this to suggest that, the vast majority of boys and girls prioritise a teacher's individual ability as a teacher and their level of care for students rather than, whether they're male or female. So whilst in one way, it would be great to increase the numbers, I don't see that as a panacea. I think it's really about relationships. And I was interested when he talked about his own background. He talked about, the relationships he had with his students. And okay, maybe he was saying there was something distinctive about him being a male teacher in that role. But actually, I would focus on the relationships part of that. That seems to be the most important element.
Which does take us back to our last episode with Judy Chu and the importance of relationships in boys' development.
Indeed.
Yeah, and I guess it's hard, isn't it? Because I do think there is a risk that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? That if we create this idea that boys will only listen to other boys or men, or, boys will only read books by men or about boys and men, if the more we talk about that, the more it feels like that has to be the solution. But actually, as you said, sometimes the evidence doesn't necessarily point to that. So that is interesting. Yeah. What else did you think about
another thing I thought was interesting was that he didn't use the language of crisis around masculinity, which I thought he might, and obviously this comes up a lot, and from the perspective of historians that we've actually interviewed, like Lucy Delap, there's always concern about supposed crises of masculinity, at the end of the 19th century, before the Boer War, during World War One. You can point to moments certainly in UK history where people were concerned about what was happening with boys and men. I think some of this is just anxiety about social change, really. It's the state of the labour market, it's concerns that men may be losing power and status to women, changes in the family, sexual politics, the rise of gay and lesbian and trans lifestyles, all of these kinds of issues. There's a whole mix there which impacts on masculinity, and that's that is about social change, really. It's not necessarily a crisis, but I think the way he put it was quite good. I mean, he talked about it as if this is a moment where we can actually make some positive changes, and we should take that opportunity and run with it. And it's hard to disagree with that as a basic approach, I think.
Yeah, it makes me think of, Raewyn Connell, another person we've had on the podcast before. She has this notion of crisis tendencies, the kind of gender order, as she calls it, I suppose, patriarchal societies, as kind of subject to these crisis tendencies because, they are inherently quite contradictory, aren't they? The system doesn't actually work very well for a lot of people a lot of the time. So it's inevitable that, periodically the instability of that system will start to become more and more clear. And I guess you could say that we are in one of those moments right now, which, as you said, definitely seems like a good opportunity to try. Well, and there is just so much more discussion at the moment, isn't there, about issues of masculinity? So it is such an important time. And so it is good to see politicians like him are actually trying to, intervene in positive ways in those discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, also there is a tension between, a sort of backward-looking approach to reinstating men's centrality and power in the family and society generally, and a more progressive approach which recognises the advances that women have made and celebrates that, and looks to a more equal future, I guess.
Yes, and maybe something I think about a lot with my research on climate change, is that maybe sometimes men can be a little bit less flexible to social change, like feel comfortable adapting to it. Because obviously something like climate change demands huge social upheavals, but maybe for men, if society is working a little bit better for men as a group, as it is, then maybe embracing change can feel uncomfortable. But it was good to hear him recognize that there is a need for gender to be taken into account across all sorts of different policies, including around climate change. It was good to recognize that.
Yeah. I was just thinking whilst you were talking about the notion that's been promoted by Andy Burnham about reindustrialization as well. And just in relation to the point you've made about adaptability, actually, that certainly there was an idea around, say, the sort of 1980s when the mines were closing, shipyards were closing, particular effects in certain parts of the UK, that men really only wanted to do those kinds of heavy industry jobs, really. But I think I'm right that Stephen Roberts has done some work on this and suggested that actually there are a lot of working class guys who are adaptable to working in the service sector, which has obviously had a major increase over many years. And so that kind of suggests there is some potential for shifts and change for young men as well as young women.
Totally. Yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it? Because I do sometimes think that some of the issues, that people point to when they talk about struggles that men and boys are going through, it's, a lot of that does tie in. Obviously, there are real issues when it comes to these constraining masculine gender norms, which is what we talk about all the time. But a lot of it is connected to economic inequality, isn't it, as well? So for example, struggles in education or struggles to find a sense of meaning and purpose, if there are a lack of decent jobs out there. And it is interesting, isn't it, that maybe implicitly a lot of the policies of Andy Burnham are actually kind of maybe trying to address some of those things. So he is placing, as you said, quite a lot of emphasis on kind of reindustrialization. He's got policies around NEETs, like people not in education, employment or training, which potentially could help. But it's interesting that there hasn't been much emphasis perhaps on that is that reindustrialization going to be green jobs? Is that good for the environment or not? Is it addressing climate change at the same time?
Yeah, and we've written about this, Stephen, haven't we? About the need for some of those green jobs and a program of insulating all the houses in the UK, for example, and a workforce that could do that. I mean, that would provide quite a lot of employment, and without going back to a sort of shipbuilding, mining nature of industry. And going along with that, people like the Women's Budget Group have talked about the need for improvements of opportunities and status and salaries in the care sector. And actually that's obviously a sector that Andy Burnham has talked about a lot in the past, particularly social care for the elderly. So, it's interesting that it feels like that this is a bit of a moment where things could shift in a positive direction. I mean, obviously it's very, very early days. I suppose the other thing I'd say about is that, coming back to one of the things you said earlier, Stephen, there are many mainstream government policies, so the benefit system, welfare reform, criminal justice, these have tended to be shaped implicitly around men, masculinity as the norm. For example, in the benefit system, well, we've tended to prioritise a male breadwinner model of sort of full-time, long-term employment, and also in relation to national insurance, to pensions as well, where other sort of non-contributory benefits, if I can put it that way, child benefit, living allowances, carers allowance, these have more likely been paid to women, but generally at a lower level as well. So there's something about... and I'd also add to that, by the way, that quite a lot of services, so health, social care, child welfare, have largely been geared towards women, both supporting but also entrenching their role as carers, and some of those services have perhaps struggled to engage effectively with men, or not tried to do so much. There are reasons for that, of course, but men can be overlooked or screened out by service providers. Either they're regarded as too dangerous to engage with, or their importance is secondary in relation to women. So I suppose my point is that there's something about making these gender issues more explicit in policy making, and it sounds like that's a bit of what's going on. Rather than these are just sort of implicitly about men and women, we actually address the gendered aspects.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was also thinking the example which I forgot about before was homelessness as well. That, to be fair to him, Andy Burnham did say in his very first speech as Prime Minister that he wanted to, eradicate homelessness. And, we know that most people sleeping on the streets are men. But equally, I think there is some consciousness as well about, what reasons why women might be, kind of homeless as well because of things like domestic abuse, So I think it's a good point you make. Yeah. The only other thing that I wanted to just mention was was just around, a point Alistair made, which I think, would have been good to get a chance to discuss it more, really. It's just the kind of culture in Westminster, in politics, because, I think we highlighted, didn't we, that clearly that has changed a lot. But I think, for everything I hear, it does sound like it is still a massive problem, not just in terms of the kind of sexism that women politicians experience, in the Houses of Parliament, for example, although I guess perhaps a much bigger issue now, of course, than it has been in the past, is all the abuse women politicians get online. But also, I suppose that what kind of connecting to what you were just saying about the kind of male default, and in this case, that our assumptions about leaders and politicians, it's but very much based on this idea of that being a man, isn't it? And I think we do still, on some level, perhaps feel uncomfortable or don't know how to react when it's a woman in that leadership role. And maybe women leaders are judged more harshly, or they're not seen as, effective leaders, unless they really do act in quite a macho way themselves, I suppose, of the kind of Margaret Thatcher variety. The reason I'm bringing this up is because, so I live in the state of Victoria here in Australia, and there's actually just been a change in the state premier here. So it was a woman, Jacinta Allen, and she was actually she got the boot by her Labour Party colleagues because she was basically doing really badly in the opinion polls a few months out from a state election.
What does that make one think of?
Well, quite. I know. Yeah. There's a lot of parallels to lots of different situations, but I know, and she did undoubtedly have many problems, with what she was doing as the premier. But I do think that she, myself included, I think we do judge women a lot more harshly sometimes, don't we? When they do this, the same things as men politicians do. I think women do often get judged more harshly than men do. So I think that is something for us to reflect on, really, isn't it? Is how can we change that?
But it's also, I'm just building on your point, really. It's about the responsibilities of male leaders.
Yes.
And actually not just politicians. We're talking about business leaders, we're talking about trade unionists, we're talking about people in the legal profession, And I'm sure this is playing to one of your strengths, Stephen, sports people as well. Sportsmen.
Totally.
And, actually we've seen some both good and negative modelling in relation to the World Cup quite recently, haven't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, we could definitely do a whole podcast episode all about that. But actually, another thing with the Premier of Victoria, Jacinta Allen, it was also one of those situations where she became the leader in a really difficult situation. It's the whole glass cliff phenomenon, isn't it? Where the only time women get a chance to be leaders is if things are in a terrible mess, and then they get blamed for that mess, and then they get kicked out. But anyway, well, thank you, Sandy, as always, for the chat, and thank you, as always, everybody, for listening. Do contact us at nowmen@gmail.com. As always, if you have questions or comments, please leave a review for the podcast on your podcast platform and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
You're so good at that, Steve.
I've got it down to a T now. I've practiced it. I practice it every episode. It's really,
Okay. Right. Bye for now.
Thanks so much. Bye. Bye.